Let's go ahead and get started for today. Good afternoon and happy Friday. We're wrapping up the third week and moving right along the quarter. So I hope that things have been going well. Again, I know this is a challenging time. I appreciate you joining on Zoom if you're not able to attend face-to-face. And remember, I'll also have the recording up after class if you need to access that. And then I have the slides up before class to help follow along. So for today, we're going to be wrapping up this week's discussion about listening in small groups. We'll be doing another activity that asks us to think about how we can develop good listening skills as we participate in groups of people. But I do want to give you a reminder about your first major writing assignment for the class. Again, this is pretty short. It's only about 2 pages. And it's a great way for you to get some feedback and then use that feedback for some of your larger writing assignments. So the group membership reflection is due next Wednesday on the 26th, submitted through Canvas. And remember that that full prompt and rubric is available for you. In order to help you with working through that assignment, I've also included through Canvas announcement this morning, as well as through this slide right here, the full APA citation for the textbook. So you're welcome to just copy paste it into your writing assignment in order to get the work cited. And then the in-text citation is just right here. Remember that you're going to want to include an in-text cite if you're directly quoting or paraphrasing. So if it's outside of common knowledge or your own personal experience, you want to include a citation. You can also, when you can, include a page number, right? So maybe if you're talking about Belden's self-perception inventory and the 9 different types of communication group membership styles, right? You might reference the page number where your group membership style is discussed in order to help us refer. Again, I hope that makes it a little bit easier for you. I've already received a couple of rough drafts or outlines from people who'd like some feedback. It's totally optional, but you're welcome to send me those. I like to give you some inline comments. If you send it as a Google Doc or a download, let you know what's working well and some things you can do to adjust. If you do plan on sending me like a draft or outline, I do encourage you to get that to me at the latest by Monday so that I have like 48 hours to turn that around to you so that you can use it in your updated draft. So you can also get in touch with me through office hours if you need help with that as well. Any questions about this assignment coming up? Again, not super intense, but a way for you to start thinking about and applying some of the skills we work. So last class, we were talking about listening, small group communication, right? Again, listening is really important and it matters to us because we're part of a club, we're part of an activity, right? Or if we're involved with things like coworkers and colleagues, right? We have to listen and understand each other's perspectives. We oftentimes feel frustrated when we're in small groups because we feel like there's people that don't pull their weight or contribute to the group, or we're not all on the same page, right? And figuring out how to create good listening skills in a good listening environment is crucial to address some of those gaps and make our experience in groups go better. We also discussed some of the ways to effectively listen in small groups. Remember that when you're part of a small group, right, the challenges that we face with listening are really different. For instance, we find ourselves having to pick up on a lot more people talking and a lot of nonverbal cues. We have less opportunity to talk ourselves, right? So we're oftentimes thinking about and planning out a response, but we also have a lot more perspectives and ideas that are brought to the table that can make the process of brainstorming a lot more exciting. And then last class's group activity was designed to focus on us sharing and hearing each other's experiences in regards to social media. Again, we kind of talked about how listening, right, is not what's happening here. Listening is more than just your ears. It's this longer process that involves really trying to understand, comprehend, and remember and evaluate a message. So again, in situations like this one, listening is not happening because he's not showing that eye contact or paying attention, right? There's a lot of nonverbal cues that the person on the right is doing that are being missed as a result of lack of listening. An active listener, right, as we talked about last class, is somebody who's really focused on understanding and making sense of the message, on really helping to understand it in their own way, to paraphrase, clarify, and just to show to the other person that they care and that they're really listening to that message, right? If you're part of a group with some close friends or teammates and people are sharing, a unique challenge that they dealt with over the weekend, like maybe somebody got an injury, right? You're going to want to listen and show that you care for your teammate. So active listening is a way that we can do that. So this class, we're going to be talking more about some of the ways that we use listening, particularly the idea of pre-listening and about how we can create an environment that facilitates good listening when we're in groups, right? Because good small group communication starts before the group even gets together. It's a question of how we manage the physical or the digital environment in a way that makes people feel comfortable and feel included. It means setting some norms and guidelines and boundaries through which members of a group communicate, right? And I think by doing that pre-listening stage, it helps us to create a better environment for everybody overall and makes us feel like our group communication goes better. Talk about some practices, good and bad, and then we'll be doing this third activity. You might have noticed on the syllabus that later in the quarter, I'm going to be asking you to do a reflection on some of these group assignments. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to do anything with it right now, but just know that you'll be reflecting on some of these group activities a bit later in the quarter, including the survival activity that we did last week, the activity we did last class with getting to know and listening to each other, and then this one that we'll be doing about listening. So one of the things that I think is important to emphasize and to talk about when we're thinking about what listening is how listening works, right, is that listening absolutely can happen digitally. It can happen through synchronous, right? You've probably heard synchronous and asynchronous to death. Synchronous, of course, means it's happening live and at the time. Doing things like phone calls, FaceTime, Zoom, so on, right, is an opportunity for us to directly listen and listen to each other talking, right? Obviously, you're picking up on each other's messages, facial expression, so on. As I brought up, the idea of Zoom fatigue, we tend to get exhausted when we're listening online because small little rectangles, there's less space to pick up on nonverbal communication. It's not three-dimensional either, although with metaverse, that could change. We also know, right, that there are more opportunities for distractions that happen when we communicate and listen synchronously, right? If you're talking to somebody face to face, yeah, there could be your phone, your mind could wander, you could daydream. But if you're tuning into a class through Zoom, there's a good chance that you might be multitasking with different tabs. You might be streaming something, right? You could be doing something like laundry and just have your laptop out next to you. So there's a lot more opportunity for distraction that can happen when we listen online. In terms of asynchronously listening, right, that would be something such as exchanging text with somebody else. It's not happening immediately. You're taking the time to read it before you respond, right? But you can do so in a way that's still meaningful. For instance, some of the ways that you could give feedback and response when listening online could be something like reacting to a message, right? Doing something like a like react, right? Or maybe you do a laugh react to a message that you don't like, having not really understood it and just control. It kind of depends on what your goal is in reacting to a message. But as we know, right, asynchronous communication can be challenging because we don't have that immediate exchange. If you ask somebody how they're doing and they say, I'm not doing so great, right? They're rolling their eyes, you hear the tone of voice. It doesn't hit the same if they're saying, I'm not doing so great via text. A couple other ideas that I think are helpful to know when we're communicating in groups. One is thinking about listening as a kind of dance, right? That listening is a two-way street, that oftentimes our attention and level of listening is really in response to the other person. I recently started watching the TV show Only Murders in the Building on Hulu. And there's this scene where there's a date, right? And it's the first date between two characters. And one of the characters has this like very personal story about their family trauma and self-disclosure, right? And then the other character kind of like closes up and withdraws non-verbally and doesn't really tell his own story. And she gets frustrated with it for not self-disclosing or really doing that, right? And her rationale is, you listen to me, basically tell my life story. Why aren't you doing the same? The idea that listening brings about this expectation in two-way street. You listen to somebody else and you hear them tell really important details, and that you have an expectation to disclose in a somewhat similar way. So oftentimes, right, our level of self-disclosure is based on the cues that we get from other people. Our willingness to communicate and understand other people is really closely connected and mirrors what we see in others. And so sender-receiver reciprocity is this idea that if you're really attentive, you're really focusing, and you're really listening, right? As somebody is talking, maybe your friend realizes how closely you're listening and puts the phone away and chooses to listen in a similar manner, right? We're using those contextual cues to try to understand what level of listening is appropriate for the situation. And then the idea of social decentering is a useful one. Again, this kind of goes back to the Atticus Finch, put yourself in somebody else's shoes perspective. The idea that you move away from understanding or listening to something as it applies to you and more as it applies to another person, right? So if you were talking to a friend and your friend says, oh, well, I went to high school in Eastern Washington, you might think, oh, I do too. I did too. I went to Eastern Washington. And you find that as a similarity. That's great, right? But avoid letting that overwhelm the discussion. Think about, okay, you went to a very different high school than I did. You had a very different experience than I did. And social decentering is a way to listen to the person and what they're saying rather than connecting everything personally. So that can be a challenge. So this is an important idea that we're going to be getting into in just a little bit for our scenario. But the idea of pre-listening, right, is, again, really important to working in groups and to do so effectively. Pre-listening, again, looks at the idea that before a group even gets together, whether it's colleagues, whether it's an activity or athletic event or anything like that, right, that there's an importance in working together. So good listening requires a bunch of different parts, right? One of them is managing the physical location, right? So say you and your friends are going to get together and do a study group because you've got a huge chemistry exam to work on, and you all have to work together to study and prepare, right? There's a lot of things you're probably going to do to try to make that a good physical location. You're going to rent something like a conference room or book a conference room on campus or at the library or something like that, right? You maybe are going to bring snacks. Maybe you bring some headphones to focus. You bring your pens or whatever you need to study. You think about time of day and if there's going to be bright lights coming. There's a lot of things that you might think about as you're physically preparing to do a study group. You also can think about the role of listening tasks, right? So for instance, if you're doing something like a job interview, right, and you are with other people in reviewing candidates and on the committee and trying to figure out who should get a job, you are going to have a really hard time if you focus on fully understanding every part of the interview. One strategy that tends to work really well, right, is to delegate listening tasks. For instance, somebody that's focused on really noticing nonverbal communication that somebody does, somebody that's more focused on the content, responses to the questions, right? Somebody that's concerned more with temperament and whether they're a fit for the job. So listening tasks are a way to divvy up responsibility and ensure that because listening covers so many different areas, right, you're able to focus on the part of listening that makes sense. Another idea, right, is to confirm the listening norms of the group. So maybe you're in a study group, you're working together to prepare, to go through material for an exam, right? Maybe as a listening norm, you say, okay, we really need to hunker down and study. Let's all put our cell phones on the table, not look at it or pay attention to them as we're working together. Confirm the listening norms, again, is really useful to understand and get everybody on the same page about how to work together. Contextual barriers, right? So does anybody want to take a stab at defining context and what high and low context might be? So we talked about high and low context cultures earlier in the quarter.
Isn't there like subtext involved?
Yeah, so that's a part of it, right?
It's like low context is super like blunt and just like saying out loud, and then
Yeah.
high context is like you recognize like you're like more considerate.
Right, exactly. A good way to test context and cultures, right, is if you were to travel abroad, right, and to go somewhere completely different, and say you knew the language, right? How out of place would you be if you started talking to somebody? For instance, as we mentioned, in places such as the United States, right, there's a greater tendency for people to say what they mean and to be direct. You want to go out with me? Somebody says no if they don't want to, right? Whereas in more high context cultures such as Japan, right, people might be less inclined to say no because it's seen as disrespectful. They might say maybe, I'm not sure, or yes in a hesitant way because they're non-verbally indicating no without saying that verbally or directly, right? In the same way, when we're thinking about groups and group norms, contextual barriers is a really major concern. That if people are not understanding language in the same way, right, there's going to be a lot of miscommunication in how people work together. If people do not know that they should be polite and avoid saying direct things like no as the group members are working together, that's going to create some friction later, right? Biases are really important considerations too, right? Thinking about the ways that things such as gender, race, sexuality, disability, nationality, sexual orientation, and so on can impact how we view and think about perspectives and voices is important. For instance, right, oftentimes there are challenges in small groups where disproportionately in groups, studies have found that women oftentimes are forced into roles more of like note-taking and following along with material, right? And those biases can happen in small groups. So it's important to take steps to try to address and to correct. Another idea as you're working in a group, right, is do you take notes? Do you record, right? And particularly if you were recording a larger set of people, like for an interview, you want to make sure that people consent to the recording and know that they're being recorded too. Surprise, you've been recorded is not a fun thing to have happen. And then also be thinking about stuff like breaks, right? We're humans, when we're in a group, again, say if we're doing like a study group, if people are starting to get exhausted and need to go to the bathroom and all that, and you haven't given like designated times to do a break, people are going to get frustrated, they're going to want it to be over, they're going to want to leave, they're going to get distracted. So by defining things like breaks, time away, it can really help the group to feel like they're having a little bit more focus because they know, okay, in 5 minutes we can go. So there's a lot of these practices of good listening. A lot of these are things that we've gone over, and I'm not going to be super detailed about. But a couple things that I do want to hit on that I think will help us to think about what it means to listen well in a group, right? Might be familiar with the classic phrase, silence is golden, right? It's the idea that just because people in a group aren't speaking in any given time does not mean it's a bad thing. Especially folks in larger families or friendship circles, oftentimes there's this desire to fill in space. If there's silence, if people are talking, they tend to feel uncomfortable and want to talk more as a way to address that. In fact, that's a big reason why we use verbal fillers. We say or because we're filling in the space as we're trying to figure out what to say next. So silence is good because it lets us take notes, lets us focus, particularly if there are folks for whom English is not their first language, or there's a lot of jargon or technical language that people in a group might not be all on the same page about. It helps people come together and really understand the message before moving on. So figuring out purpose. Why are you listening? What is the goal here? Are you listening to appreciate somebody, to hear them out, to be empathetic, right? Or are you listening to try to reach a solution? Figuring out the level that people communicate a message. So are they communicating it to a larger public audience or just a group of people. Figuring out the significance, of course, the major ideas, what are the takeaways or things you would paraphrase or restate are important considerations. One thing that's really useful, right, is if you find over the course of your work in a group that you have one or two people that are just not as engaged or aren't saying as much, giving them the time to speak and let them know that their voices are being included can be really helpful. We talked about nonverbal communication, interactive questions, and that type of feedback, right, can be really useful. Make sure that people are feeling included. Using confirming statements can be really helpful. For instance, saying, so you've worked here for about 4 years, right? Can be a good way for you to work with the other person to confirm messages that you're receiving and also to show that you're listening. So interrupting is normally not a good thing, but there are a lot of situations, for instance, if somebody goes totally off task or off topic, where it's a good idea to interrupt or refocus the message. If somebody is talking for like 5 minutes about, for instance, visas, they start talking about their credit card, really you're talking about H-1B visas, right, for folks who might immigrate to the United States, then you are wasting their time and yours. So sometimes if it's clarifying or if somebody's getting off topic, interrupting can help everybody to refocus. We talked a little bit about paraphrasing, saying it in your own words, and careful responses when you're really thinking through what somebody else has to say before you address. So in a lot of academic circles, right, I go and I present some of my research at conferences. There's this running joke or meme, right, where after people present their research, there's like a question and answer period, right? And a lot of times you're going to get people in these conferences where they like want to make a statement about their own stuff, but they present it as a question. So for instance, like you presented a project like for class or for research and they say, you know, I think I would have done this differently. I don't really like the approach that you did. What do you think? Right? Where it's this like really loaded like statement or comment. It's not really a question, but it's more designed to like critique or make it about you, but just has a question mark, right? It's an example of a counterfeit question. A bad approach to good listening, right? Where you're injecting your statement and framing it as a question in a way that comes across as passive aggressive, it's not genuine, it's not helpful. So that's an issue. Another problem, right, is just to listen and let it be a dead end where you don't do anything. For instance, if you had a guest speaker who came and started talking about ways to create new opportunities for technology, you're like, oh, that's great. You don't do anything with it or talk about how you could use new technology in your group, for instance, a new app, then your group is not going to be able to get anything out of it. Another challenge, right, is to focus too much on how other people are listening. So for instance, right, if you're listening to somebody speak in a group and somebody starts like yawning or rolling their eyes or texting on their phone, right, that does not mean that you have a free pass to do that too, right? So don't let that kind of chain reaction happen. Obviously, cutting somebody else off mid-sentence and interrupting them in a way that isn't appropriate can be a really big problem too. It can help people feel less comfortable. Again, a counterfeit question. It's like a statement. It's presented as a question. Things like tone can be important too, right? So letting things like somebody's pitch or way of speaking overly impact the way that the message is understood. And then while it's important for you to paraphrase, to say, to relate a message, right? One challenge is that you don't want to make your work in a group too focused on what your interpretation of the message was, right? Again, that gets at the idea of social decentering, of making it not about you. Because if you say, hey, you know, I really liked your story. It reminded me of the time that I used to walk my dog down this trail and then I ran into a bear, right? And you start getting off topic, you're losing that person's message and story to make it better. So that can be a challenge of good listening is that if you overly share your point of view, it can risk getting you off track. So things to think about in terms of strategies of good listening and ways to address some of our bad listening behaviors. So what I want to do now is take about 15 minutes or so and have a scenario for you. And I'm going to have the Zoom folks in a group. And then I'm also going to have a couple groups here, the folks here face to face. And your group members are all working for a local newspaper. And your newspaper company is interviewing candidates for a new writer position. What I'd like your group to do, and you can have one person who writes or types per group that has your names of all the members on it, is to explain in as specific detail as possible with what we talked about today, how your group is going to use pre-listening to create a listenable environment, a good environment for your job candidates. For instance, you might talk about how your group members are going to take on specific roles in preparation for the interview. And for this part, you should assume that you're meeting the candidates face to face. And then for the second part, I want you to assume that the candidates for this interview are being interviewed through Zoom. And I also want you to talk about how your group could create a good environment for people on. So again, I'll give you about 15 minutes to work on this and talk through these parts of it together. Come up with a plan on how you would, and paint a picture for us on what this pre-listening environment would look like. Also make sure to have one person per group who will be sharing. So it looks like we have, so let's do 2 groups face to face and 1 group through Zoom. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So we have 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then Zoom folks, I'll put you in a breakout room. You're welcome to do a screenshot of this. I also have all the slides on Canvas in case you need to access it through there too. Make sure you all also have a person who will be recording for your work too. All right.
Does anyone want to use Chrome?
Cool.
Aaron, you in that way?
So, explain to me how you listen to the Bible. So,
I would think we create a document and send it out to them and say, this is what we're expecting. Like something like
explain that.
yeah, what material.
So like set expectations for like,
Yeah.
I mean,
And
nice.
contact candidates beforehand and set expectations and what they
Good
know.
vibes.
how they can do it.
Yeah.
I got it as a sample.
What?
I got it as like.
Yeah.
Actually, because it's going to be, it's not just quiet and boring.
For pre-listening, so like.
That's a very
So I guess.
So like say like it's gonna be so I don't know, it could be like in a conference room, something like that, in a closed area without a lot of noise.
Don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Side listening channels.
Also like the roles, I guess. When I was like doing it, I thought more than one, but for my conference, I bring more people in to get design. So in that document, I can say, we need people to fill these sections.
So you can do like assign people roles, like someone
Maybe
ask
determine
ask all questions, someone like explain characteristics, like what the job is,
Yeah.
stuff like that. Further seeing norms for group. So discuss, so the interviews beforehand, you discuss how how to sing games, I guess.
Somebody else.
Recognize biases, that's also just. So 40, so another one, assign someone to be a locator. Determine how breaks. Probably a good idea. Break.
Yeah,
Oh,
I guess. If we're preparing for a conference and it was pretty long. I don't know how long I'm set standards, but it's only 2 hours and a 30-minute break.
Okay.
Lunch. Conference. If it's that.
It's maybe part one, is it?
Yeah.
For instance, explain how. So now part two is how would you do for Zoom?
Yeah.
So, in part two, you need to put mainly, I feel like the characteristics of part one.
Yeah.
should be
We'll
part
talk
two.
about work.
The way they would need to
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
is like,
Yes.
express with all like, interviewers, like the importance of like, really and not like, like having your camera on, and still kind of know what they're there, whatnot.
No request to be in a certain area. So that when the noise-
Yeah. The union requests that, all of the people interviewing would not be in the, closed location, where they don't have distractions or noise.
Let's be in that restaurant.
Yeah.
You said something about cameras having.
Yeah, make sure, I didn't want to have the camera on. Or actually listen to it.
Maybe even for the person who gave you, even when you don't want to be able to.
Project R.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to carry? I think we're talking. You got it?
Area
Yeah.
they want to work on. As far as the regulation.
All right, take about 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Sounds like most of the groups are about that. You might want to double check and just see, were you to do the interview, what are the specific roles that you each would individually take? If you haven't done so already. We'll give another couple minutes for the Zoom folks, and then we'll have us each group share.
Oh.
Expectations set it.
Not close the room, so Zoom folks should be joining us here in just a second. Okay, so what I'd like each group to do is to share basically the picture that they've painted as far as creating a listenable environment, including the specific things that they would do to prepare and make the job interview environment as positive as possible. And then secondarily, some of the ways that would look different through Zoom. So why don't we start with the group here on this side?
So the first thing we said was before you even are doing your interview, set expectations through like an email or through the job listing, just expectations you want from the interview person or the interviewee.
Yeah, so that's a good starting point for sure.
And then we said, have a calm environment, like a conference room or something where it's not going to be hectic and you can listen and respond clearly to other people. And then we had assigned roles. And then some that we just quickly jotted down would be like a note taker, a questioner, someone asking the questions, a responder who would be responding to questions that the person would have, and then somebody would watch the time.
Sure.
And then it would matter how you would listen to the candidate. That's an important part. And then set calm periods if needed, especially if it's like a long 2-hour interview.
Sure.
And that was for in person. Over Zoom. We said basically the same stuff, except have your camera on if you can, and if not, at least be interactive through the chat.
Sure. So if you were doing like a face-to-face job interview, what would you do to make sure that you all were listening and doing what you needed to do?
That kind of goes into the calm environment where
Yeah.
there's not much to distract yourself with. It's
Yeah.
you and then the person you're interviewing, basically.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Because oftentimes we don't think a lot going into an interview about how we, as people doing the interview, asking the questions and so on, are listening and paying attention to the interview, right? Because if it looks like we're losing focus or drifting away, the interviewee is going to be super freaked out and concerned that, you know, maybe they're not doing a good job, people aren't paying attention, and so on, right? So creating, like you were saying, that calm environment is really important. Also setting expectations on the use of technology, video camera on, all of that sort of thing is really important. When I had my first round interview for this job, it's funny, right? Like 5 minutes before the Zoom call, I was told that it was just going to be audio. So I got like all dressed up and ready to go, and got my Zoom screen all ready, and then found out right before it was through audio. And so situations like that, where there are those changes and expectations, are things that are important to convey to people in something like an interview or group meeting. What are people expected to do? Let's hear from the Zoom folks. What did you all think about as far as creating a good and positive environment for an interview, both face-to-face and online?
So for us, the in-person, one person has to be in charge of sending the emails and sending the calls, or just to let them know. And then one has to set up the location, the time.
Mhm.
And then one has to like provide snacks and like water if they come in the office. And then one has to be in charge of like asking the questions. And then one has to take notes and record.
Mhm.
That's for in person and in Zoom.
Mhm.
And then we will provide like our card information just in case they have like questions after the interview,
Mhm.
and our contact numbers. And same in Zoom, we set out our expectations. Someone has to be in charge of recording and taking notes,
Mhm.
and also like giving them our contacts just for like later purposes.
Mhm. Yeah, I really like the way that your group is thinking about sort of making things as clear and comfortable for the person being interviewed as possible. Like contact information, providing snacks, providing just information that helps them to feel like they're being included and involved. I kind of pose the same question. How would you ensure that the interviewers for you all as a group would be comfortable and able to listen to the interviewees yourselves?
I think first we just ask them like about their personal like life and experiences, so we can all relate and understand each other. And yeah.
One strategy that can work really well, right, is if you're working with a group on something like an interview or on something like a big project, right, is to have an informal meeting ahead of time, like getting food together, going out, doing something fun, or even just like an icebreaker, right, where you share some fun facts about yourself. It's a way to know and to create an environment in which people are more comfortable taking on the different roles of the interview. Because again, there's a lot of trust that might be involved in that process too. So thanks for sharing. And let's hear from the group here on the side.
So for the in-person, we just wanted to have like a big room and we want it pretty lit up, so, and like focus, so we can focus in on who we're interviewing. We also thought about giving them snacks, like a drink or something like that to make them feel comfortable. Also like to just explain to them, like, okay, this is kind of how it's gonna work, like they're gonna ask the questions and we're gonna write over here, like everyone like go down the line. And just like kind of reassure them like why you're writing or taking notes. Definitely no distractions, just because we want to be professional, so keep phones away and everything like that. They said to just like make eye contact with the speaker so that they make like feel engaged. And then also like an icebreaker. And that's just what I said before, where how like you kind of explain what's going on, or you can shake hands at the beginning and kind of introduce everyone on the staff or whatnot. And then on the Zoom one, we said, like they said, all cameras on, and then you want to make sure you're still in a professional like attire, on the top at least.
Yes. Pajamas are fine. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then we also said that if the questions were prepared beforehand from the resume or whatnot, then you can be more prepared and work just thinking off your toes. Again, we just said like with the nonverbal cues, you want to make sure that, especially in Zoom, that you don't kind of over exaggerate it and make sure that you look like you're paying attention. And then you can also make sure that you're paying attention by having counter questions to something they say, like whether it's like an interest that they have or something like that. You can have a counter question for that. So that's
Yeah.
what we came up with.
Yeah, really good points there, right? I really like, again, the way that you have this sort of expectation of professionalism, but also clear communication about what that means so that somebody feels prepared. I like the way that your group was talking about the sort of guidelines for how an environment is, neutral, there's not distractions, there's a place where people can get together and work. So I think there's some really good observations there too, how to create that kind of physical space where people feel like they can participate and make their voices heard. A couple other things that I would add that I haven't heard, but again, are just things to continue to brainstorm and to think through about this is, first of all, if a meeting is happening on Zoom, right? Folks mentioned having video on. You might also think about stuff like audio, right? So if you're in a small group, be cognizant of the fact that not everybody is going to be muted who should be when there's distractions. And my last class said hot mic moments that can happen where people start saying random stuff in the middle of the meeting. Also, maybe set some boundaries about when that is and is not appropriate to have a mic off. One other thing to think about when it comes to a meeting that might happen face-to-face is time management, right? Because say you have 3 or 4 different interviews or running back to back, you only have so much time for each one. You might think about how you're going to interrupt or maybe keep people on track to manage the limited time that you might have, right? So that can be a concern, is creating a respectful and positive environment, but also managing some of those challenges, right? And an interview is one example of a situation where your group has to work together and create a situation where people can feel listened to and heard. But again, there's a lot of other situations where creating a listenable environment, using listening and all that stuff is really important. For instance, again, something like a study group, something like a team meeting, both kind of personal and friends as well as professional contexts. So continue to think about some of these strategies and ways that ahead of time you can create that good environment for people to work together. So to wrap up the things that we went over today, right? We talked a lot about pre-listening, the ways that we can create this positive and clear space for people, whether it's face-to-face or digitally, right? Setting the boundaries and norms is a good way to make communication happen in the way that we want it. Practices of listening, good and bad. Avoiding those counterfeit questions, their statements. Focusing instead on really understanding and paraphrasing and giving feedback to the message. And then also the idea of listening in groups, understanding where people are coming from, and what they have to say, right, helps a lot of our groups work a lot better. It helps us feel more comfortable when we're working in groups for all sorts of different tasks. So going into next week, we're going to focus on international and intercultural communication, the ways that those impact groups, all important issues to think about as we're thinking about working with diverse and unique groups as well. So have a great weekend. Best of luck as you're working on your group membership reflection, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Please email or pass forward your group's work for today if you haven't already done so. And I'll see you again on Monday.